Hello everyone, welcome to the next webinar in our now lengthy series delivered for Closomat, this time on MS, supporting the person through housing design. And for this particular webinar, you'll notice as we go through it, or certainly a particular part, there's something slightly different. So rather than just me talking about my experience of working with someone or people with MS and the bit of research we've done around MS and the importance of specific housing design for someone with MS, we've taken the views of someone who's living with MS, a good friend of mine, who agreed to sit down and have a chat through how his symptoms present for him and the impact that the environment has on him and his ability to engage in purposeful and meaningful activity. And I think it's quite meaningful for us just to actually to listen to what he talks about and what he says. So as much as we do the other things that we have tended to do within these webinars, and to provide some general information about the condition and the impacts and what we can do when we're thinking about our clinical reasoning and our evidence base, I think the interview with Matthew within this is quite hard hitting. So I hope you enjoy it. So we're going to explore the etiology and epidemiology of MS. We're going to reflect on the functional and occupational impacts of MS, and we're going to consider how home modifications have impacted on the life of someone with MS, as I mentioned there before. So what is MS? For some of you on the webinar, or maybe a lot of you on this webinar, this might be a bit of a refresh. If you've worked as an occupational therapist for long enough in community settings, or obviously if you're in neurological services, you will have come across someone with MS and no doubt worked with them as an occupational therapist. But it's good to have a bit of a refresh to further understand the evidence base, to understand the condition, and maybe just reflect on the interventions that you tend to apply with someone with MS. But for some of you on the webinar, this could be brand new, which is great. It makes pitching content quite difficult, but hopefully we're able to get to both of those. So it's an autoimmune demyelinating condition that affects the central nervous system. And we're going to come on to, you probably saw the next slide there, we're going to come on to what that means shortly. It's progressive and often unpredictable. And there are typically three main diagnoses, three different types, and there are relapse remitting, primary progressive, and secondary progressive. Now, more contemporary diagnoses of MS may likely use different terminology, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. But certainly my experience is still that those phrases are being used, and we're going to explain a bit about what that means. So what does autoimmune and demyelinating mean? I'm sure the vast majority of people on this webinar understand what autoimmune means. So that is where the body interprets or perceives there being something to fight off, whether it be a virus or something like that. So it perceives that there's something for it to fight, even when there isn't. And that fighting of something off causes inflammation and it causes damage because it's doing it in the wrong way for the wrong reasons. So during an MS attack, the immune system triggers inflammation along the nerves, damaging the myelin, which is stripped from the axon, which is why it's therefore demyelinating. Messages passing down the nerve therefore become delayed or blocked, and that causes neurological symptoms that can be different for each person. The image that I've used there, anyone who's on the webinar who either remembers, depending on when you trained, or was familiar with Huxley's sliding filament theory may understand or may appreciate that diagram, which I've taken from the MS Trust site. So Huxley's sliding filament theory looks at how muscles contract, essentially. So it looks at how electrical impulses travel down the axon from the neuron and then to the muscle body to stimulate contraction and all the different enzymes that are released along the way. What you can see from that image there is that with MS, it's autoimmune. The result of it being autoimmune means that the myelin sheath becomes stripped away, which impacts how electrical impulses flow down the axon. I'm not going to go into that into too much depth. in case you're either not interested in that or in case something you already know. If you don't know it, go and have a look at Huxley's sliding filament theory to get a better understanding if you wish. The reason I've put that in is even though we're not focusing on diagnoses and we're not necessarily as occupational therapists focusing on the core biological or anatomical science behind it, if we don't have a reasonable understanding of the condition, then our ability to provide a robust evidence base and clinically reasoned recommendations becomes impaired, I think. There was a similar diagram, a similar image on the previous webinar that I delivered around Parkinson's. So again, we're not going to go into that a lot of depth because it's on the Closomat's YouTube site, so you can take a look at that there. But there are similarities, but also significant differences between the two, and it'd be good for you to go and explore what those similarities and differences are and how all of a sudden we come up with very different neurological conditions that present in very different ways and therefore impact our recommendations very differently. So as I said earlier, there are predominantly three types of MS: relapsing, remittent, secondary progressive, and primary progressive. These images from the MS Society website, I think, are really clear indicators of what that means and how that they present for an individual. So relapse remitting is where someone could present with a relapse, their level of impairment or disability, using the language within the diagram there, increases. They have that for a period of time and then go into a period of remittance where they're completely back to the way they were pre-relapse. However, it also shows that over a period of time, as relapses become where the person's had more relapses over their lifetime, the level that they return to is just not quite as it was before. So over a long period of time, someone can move from relapse remitting into secondary progressive. And secondary progressive, as you can see there, which is the middle diagram, the person's had some relapses, but then over a period of time has just steadily started to gradually decline their baseline with the odd relapse in between. And primary progressive is where there aren't relapses. There's just that steady increase in impairment or level of disability over a period of time. And the more contemporary terms there are included in the bottom. So relapse remitting is active or non-active, secondary progressive is worsening or stable, and primary progressive is with or without progression. So if you come across different phrases, that's just what they mean, but essentially they're saying the same thing. They're just using what might be slightly more contemporary language to diagnose it. So causes and risk factors for MS. So there's evidence that there's genetic susceptibility. So someone in the family who has MS puts you at higher risk. Certain environmental triggers, possible viral links. So there's some very specific ones, or certainly a very specific one that you can look up. There's also some myths around viral links. Some that don't necessarily directly cause, but there is known to be in the future a higher prevalence of MS diagnosis for people who've had certain viral illnesses, but without established direct links. But it's interesting research that you can have a look at. There's definitely a higher prevalence in women than men, and it's more common in northern climates. I certainly know from my caseload over the years that I've seen a lot more women than men with MS and a lot more men than women with Parkinson's. So it's an interesting link there from a gender perspective. Some of the key statistics: so over 130,000 people in the UK live with MS. That equates to 1 in every 500. There's approximately 7,100 new diagnoses per year, and the average diagnosis age, according to statistics, is between 30 and 40. My experience of that is very much in the 40s, but statistically it's 30 to 40s. I wonder if on reflection, if the younger side of that, so the nearer the 30s, is where someone is presenting very early with certain presentations, and they're going through a range of testing for other neurological conditions and then discover MS as part of that, whereas the 40 plus, maybe it's just all of a sudden symptoms that somebody's been having is the person then goes to their healthcare professional and is then diagnosed. But certainly my experience has been 40s. And women are 2.5 times more likely to be diagnosed than men. And we briefly referenced that in the previous slide. So the functional occupational impacts of MS. So from a physical perspective, somebody can present with extreme fatigue. They can present with spasticity, so that's fixed muscle contractions, muscle weakness, and impaired mobility as a result of those things, bladder and bowel dysfunction, visual impairment, issues with coordination and balance, and reduced dexterity or fine motor skills. Now, interestingly, if you looked at all those things and you put, say, this and, I don't know, Parkinson's presentation side by side, a lot of those could feature across them both. But what we need to understand is that there's distinct differences as to why. So when we understand the physiological reasons and the neurological reasons why those things are happening, our recommendations change because we understand what causes them and we understand how they're going to or not going to progress, as opposed to other conditions um, like a Lewy body dementia or vascular dementia or Parkinson's, where there are all significant neurological elements to them, but we understand the causes and the outcomes, and therefore our evidence base changes. There's a cognitive and emotional impact, so there can be some deterioration in memory, attention span, executive functioning, anxiety, depression, emotional ability. And in my experience, and certainly when I talk to Matthew, who you'll see shortly, some of his issues around if he gets anxious or gets low in mood, it's a reflection on when he's feeling like there's something he's not able to do or achieve. So rather than the neurological element causing, say, depression, it's around part of what could be described as a grieving process. And the occupational impacts from all of that are probably self-explanatory. So within self-care, things like using the toilet, washing, getting dressed, productivity, including work, domestic tasks, childcare. Don't forget, we're talking about people here diagnosed in their 30s and 40s. So these are working age adults. So the things that we have to consider for this group of people could be significantly different. Maybe not, but could be significantly different to somebody who presents quite similar, but with a vascular dementia in their 80s. The things that they find meaningful and purposeful and their life roles and their life stages are completely different. So the things that we're implementing here, the goals that we're setting, are often very different. Often here we're looking at how does mum pick the child up from school and get them home? How does the parent get to work or the person get to work and back? How do they go to the pub? How do they do the things that if I think of myself in my 40s that I do on a daily basis, it's those sorts of activities and things and routines that we're often supporting the person with. And sometimes within statutory services, they're the things that we can miss. We're so focused on need-led and self-care that we forget our role as occupational therapists is to support need, want, and expectation. And we say we're holistic, but if we're forgetting the leisure, the joy, the hope, then are we applying occupational therapy in the way that we ought to be? And that just reflects there in the roles. So the roles could be different. They're employee, employer, spouse, parent. And variability in progression, so dramatic changes in energy or exercise tolerance, and therefore the impact on functional engagement. And they can be day to day, they can be based on season to season, they can be dependent on the environment, and they can be task specific. So it's not easy for us as occupational therapists to plan necessarily for someone with MS whose condition can present differently from one day to the next based on certain conditions of their environment or the task that they're doing. And Matthew talks about that within the in the video that we're going to come on to. Significant seasonal changes. So people who I've seen with MS struggle much more with fatigue in the summer when it's really warm. So while we're out enjoying the beach, they're trying to regulate temperature to make sure they can just function the next day and do the basic tasks. So really significant things in there for us to consider. And the environment and symptom management. So we need to be thinking about energy conservation, safety within the environment, including falls, and not just fall prevention, but fall recovery. Delayed initial recovery is incredibly important for anybody who is at a risk of falls. Sometimes we have to accept that people are going to fall, but how they recover following a fall has a significant impact on their functional and health outcomes. And providing cognitive and psychological support. So common recommendations include things like level access showers, stair lifts or home lifts, automated lighting, ergonomic kitchen layouts, and temperature controls. So anything that we can do that maximizes efficiency for that person and reduces risk whilst maximizing engagement. And that's again, we would probably say the same thing for everybody, but it's understanding the specific conditions in which somebody with MS might discover challenges that then impair their ability to be independent or engage in things that are meaningful. Temperature control is a real significant one that I come across regularly with my clients with MS. And within housing design, it's not something that is thought about enough. So how we use or how we specify particular window types that maintain the internal ambient temperature, whether we should be including recommendations for air conditioning within properties or rooms that we're designing for somebody with MS. I can't stress enough how important temperature control is for someone with MS and their outcomes. And that's what I've suggested there. So air conditioning or other cooling systems could also be considered where heat exposure can cause or heighten fatigue, numbness, blurry vision, tremors, confusion, imbalance, and weakness as associated with conditions such as MS. So it says that within the DFG delivery guidance. We're very fortunate with that guidance for a condition like MS that it specifically uses that as an example. That can obviously be transferred across other areas or other conditions. But the fact that that's in there as an example just highlights how important temperature control in rooms and buildings is for someone with MS. And it has a significant impact on all of those presentations. So please just be aware that things like air conditioning can be recommended through DFG as long as you can determine that it's necessary and appropriate. So when I was writing this, and I've talked about it a bit, but I was writing this thinking there is a lot within this that is directly transferable across other conditions or across other webinars that we've delivered even. We've delivered so many webinars now. Some of this content I read back and thought, how do I get across the fact that this isn't just a regurgitation of content that's already been delivered? We're talking about occupational therapy here and self-care, productivity, leisure, for example. Clearly, there are going to be similarities, but where is the specialism in it? And in my own reflection, it was around how we generate and create a robust evidence base that supports our clinical reasoning. So us being able to talk about occupational therapy isn't enough. Us being able to understand the condition specifically, understand its presentation, understand the physiology behind it, understand the real intricate details of what makes MS different to Parkinson's and Parkinson's different to vascular dementia or Lewy body dementia, even though some of the presentations might look on the face of it to be very similar. That's the key. And I don't think sometimes, even though we say we're evidence-based, I sometimes on reflection wonder where that evidence base comes from, whether it's just something we're recommending things or doing things because we always have. So, for example, I went into Matthew's house which is currently being redesigned with an extension. But on the plans, there is no provision for temperature control, whether it be heat or cold. Nobody's considered air conditioning. Nobody's considered other quite key aspects, but the basics are all there. So someone's done a very good job of applying occupational therapy. But probably if I asked what their evidence base was for either including or omitting certain aspects of that, I think they would struggle. And that's what I'm trying to use as a starting point for this and other webinars is let's explore, let's improve our knowledge so that our evidence base can be robust. What I want to do now is hear from Matthew. I think the video is about 6 minutes long. I was there for a long time, and we've cut this down to about 6 minutes, I think. So Matthew is a good friend of mine who I've known for a long time and has MS as well as some other conditions. Matthew's going to talk very openly about how it affects him and maybe what else could be considered to support him.
My name's Matthew Davison. I was an assistant head teacher at a primary school, which I loved. And in August 2019, I had some seizures when I had my grandma shopping in Morrison's. I had an MRI scan there, and they found 2 brain tumours and some signs of MS. So once I processed all of that, I went to the RVI to have my malignant tumour debulked because they couldn't remove all of it. Got through that, had 12 months of chemotherapy, 6 weeks of radiotherapy, and I felt fine. I was jogging, playing football, doing all the things I loved. My wife at the time and I were trying for a baby. I had one, luckily. And then I was folding some clothes up in the nursery and I collapsed. And she said, "What's happened?" And I said, "Oh, I've just fallen." And I went to the hospital, had more tests done, and they said, "You've got relapsing remitting MS." The heat absolutely floors us when it's hot and like I can hardly move. So I need to be cooled down. When I have UTIs, that's shocking because I've got to self-catheterize as well. So sometimes we need my mum to hold us up so I can have a wee. Very limited energy. I did a course at Watergate where I was an inpatient for about 6-7 weeks, and we did a fatigue management course, me and my mum, and they were saying like all the things that can make people with MS fatigued, and lots of them like were ringing true because when my mum didn't have our own house, were staying at my sister's, and I didn't realise at the time, but that was wearing us out, not just physically but mentally. I've got a daughter, so she just makes everything better. And I've got a season ticket at Newcastle United, which I love. I just love it. Especially now when we've picked up a bit. So, and I've got really good mates as well. Really good mates. It's been hard to accept it, but I've just sort of realised that you can't do that now, Matthew. You can't do that. You've got to find different ways of doing things. If I know I've got my daughter, I literally have to have the day before of doing nothing, because I'll know that when I get my daughter, I'll be able to engage with her a lot more and things like that. Same when I'm going to the match. If I'm going to the match, access, I find you notice it so much now, but like places that aren't wheelchair accessible, there's so many places like that. Toilets, toilet accessibilities. You don't realise how much not being able to do the basic things really affect you. So going to the toilet, I've got to go upstairs, got to self-catheterise, and even that wears it out. Actually going up the stairs, putting the catheter in, so all that stuff. I've got a stair lift, which is amazing because it gets us upstairs. And I've also got a bed stick on the side of my bed, which is great because I can pull up on that. And I've got a Closomat toilet, which is amazing. Honestly, it's like one of the best things I've ever had. I was a really fit, independent lad, and once the MS flared up, I just felt like all that had been taken away, and I was feeling sorry for myself and things like that. But then when I had a quiet word with myself, I was thinking, this is your life now, Matthew. See it for what it is. You've still got a wonderful family, great group of friends, beautiful daughter. So it's not all doom and gloom.
So that conversation went on for a long period of time, and the bits about Newcastle United were certainly cut a lot shorter, given that Matthew knows who I support. But I hope that that's just a very brief insight into how MS affects him, and how he manages, how he gets by, the things that haven't been considered. I think he's stressed there about the heat and the temperature. So I hope that's interesting for you to reflect on. It's worth mentioning that Matthew was deputy head teacher of a local school, very responsible job, did a lot within the local community, was very well known, volunteered his time. So very active, intelligent young man who had a lot of those roles stripped away from him in a very short period of time. His outlook on life is just inspirational if you spend any time with him. But it clearly shows how MS presents with him, and therefore the things that we should be considering. You know, when I was there and Matthew talked there about what he has, and he mentioned the bed stick there, and I went upstairs and I saw him use it. He was exhausted after he'd used it, and I think even things like that, when we're considering the recommendations for someone with MS, is yes, it was great because he could pull himself up, but he's using energy to pull himself up. Anything that we can do that supports the person to be active without expending energy is what we should be considering for someone with MS. But I hope you thought the video was insightful. So what insight does Matthew provide? He talks about his meaningful occupations and the things that he's still able to engage in and the things that he now doesn't feel like he can. He talked about his roles as a father, as a football fan, as a son. He talked about all those things and the impact MS has had on them. He talked about temperature control. He talked about his frustrations with access and what adaptations he has or could do with. I certainly talked about how his condition is completely unpredictable and how he has to plan not only his day or week or month, but he has to look at what he's going to be doing, say with his daughter, he mentioned, I think it was, in advance, so that he structures his week so that he has as much energy as possible when he gets to see her. So all those sorts of things are things that we can be supporting someone with MS with. Um, So when we're thinking about some of the challenges, I've kind of put just a really basic graphic up there about what some of the solutions can be. So when we're thinking about fatigue or fluctuating mobility, we've got things like level access, short routes, seating to support someone to stand without expending too much energy. With the falls risk, we've got anti-slip flooring, stair lift or home lifts, grab rails, banisters. For heat sensitivity, environmental controls, including ventilation and air conditioning. Within cognitive or sensory impairments, contrasting colours, simple layouts that support the person's routines. We've done a separate webinar on visual impairment, which would be really useful if you're working for someone with MS, because visual impairment, blurred vision, is a very common symptom. So the webinar covers things like colour contrast, light reflective values, task lighting, all those sorts of things, which are just as relevant for or would be just as relevant for Matthew, and therefore potentially with other people with MS. Bladder and bowel management and personal care, you've got the option of wash dry toilets. As Matthew said in his video there, his Closomat Pomavita is an absolute lifesaver for him. It means that he doesn't need to ask his mum, who he lives with, to help. It provides him with dignity and support and as much independence as he can achieve. And carer reliance, so smart technology and thinking about proportionate or single-handed care if the person is needing to be hoisted. So just some examples of the things that we can do. Absolutely not um, the only things, obviously, but just a list of the things to start to be considering. So in summary, MS is a complex condition with highly individual presentations and therefore needs. Listening to lived experience, applying robust design principles and aligning with standards can make homes truly enabling rather than disabling spaces. We need to consider our understanding of the condition in conjunction with narrative and activity analysis to communicate robust clinical reasoning. There's some resources there for you to use. MS Society I used a lot during this presentation. It has some fantastic resources on there. There's the nice guidelines there for MS, building regulations for approved Part M, which is specifically around wheelchair accessibility. I know Matthew mentioned the lack of wheelchair, the frustration around wheelchair access there, and K is around falls, which is slightly less known by people, and foundations for DFG specific guidance. There's related webinars there for you to use with links. So when this is presented to you, you'll be able to click on those links. So we've got Parkinson's and housing design, dementia, long-term conditions and bathroom design, bathroom and falls. And one that I haven't put on there, but I have referenced for you is the visual impairment. I think they'll all fit quite nicely with this one if you want to explore some of the things in a bit more depth. So thanks very much for attending this webinar. Hopefully we've been able to answer all the questions that you have in the live chat. But if there are any more questions, we'll come or anything we haven't been able to answer, now is our opportunity to come on and answer them live for you. Thank you.